Welcome to your final government lecture of your senior year. Woo! All right, let's get going. This is sort of a scattershot that is going to cover everything that we haven't covered yet for the legislative branch. Away we go. So, when we left off, we were talking about committees, and now the question is what else does Congress do other than sit in committees and write laws? And write laws is really our first answer here, is that is participation within the legislature. So that is your hearings, that is your write laws, that is basically everything, is that is sort of your giant catch-all. But especially, and I mean especially here with the House, the Senate does this, but not nearly as much, is represent and communicate with constituents. What do the people of your state or the people of your district want? How are you going to get that done? How are you going to justify, as a member of Congress, especially as a member of the House of Representatives, getting elected, and what have you done to deserve reelection? That's one of the last things you guys are going to do in this class is explain why your bill is beneficial for your constituents from the state you have from that I Side With quiz. And also campaigning. It never stops for the House. And in the Senate, it never truly stops. It just sort of slows down in the couple of years after you get reelected. So, for example, like right now, Tester isn't doing much campaigning. You know, he shows back up in the state. He works with people, he glad hands people, but he is not out there actively campaigning like Senator Daines is right now because Senator Daines is up for reelection this fall. Also, just politician stuff. So when you think about this, this is, going and advocating for businesses within your state. This could be, going and making speeches at conventions for your political party. So Tester might speak at one for the Democrats, Dane might speak at one for the Republicans. It's that sort of stuff. So just kind of day to day what you think of for politics. Did you write a law? Did you go to a hearing? That participation within the legislature, that's what the job is it's everything we covered in that bill making process we went over earlier. It's also dealing with all of this stuff. So you've got three types of powers here, and I'll put this on that little quiz you guys take at the end of this. Your first type are expressed powers, those enumerated powers we talked about earlier. If you remember way back in like October when we went through the Constitution, we looked at all the stuff that Congress can do. So anything in that right-hand column is fair game for Congress to deal with, pass laws on, regulate, all that. But outside of the expressed powers, we also have implied powers. So that's stuff like the elastic clause. Can we reasonably assume Congress has the power to do thing X? And if the answer is yes, and really with Congress, they're able to use that elastic clause, anything that's necessary and proper, to expand out to whatever they need to do. More on that in a minute. And then lastly, we have those inherent powers. If you remember back to our federalism section, that's the thing that tied some of you guys up because it's like, where is it in the Constitution? And the answer is, it's not really in the Constitution. It's just expected of you as a government. So that is, protecting your borders, having a code of laws, things like that, making sure there are no rebellions, fun things along those lines. As I said, we're going to go through this rather quickly because as we've kind of seen really in everything we've done second semester is it's just a more in-depth look at the Constitution stuff that we went over first semester. A big thing for Congress is taxes. Taxes come out of Congress specifically, and you need to know this, I've said this so many times this year, tax bills need to originate within the House of Representatives. The Senate can propose them, but they have to start off in the House of Representatives. So if some senator comes up with a tax proposal, and honestly, they probably won't. If you are a lawmaker and you're super into taxes, Paul Ryan, for example, you are going to run for the House because you want to deal with taxes directly. Senate, remember, long-term stuff. International trade, defense, agreements that go on for decades. Whereas the House is that more immediate level of stuff like taxation, which is why you are going to start that stuff in the House. But if you're a senator and you really want to deal with tax legislation, you can do that, but you're going to have to find somebody to work with in the House, and they're going to be the ones that are going to have to, put their John Hancock on the bill to start it off. Anything can be taxed, and basically any purpose. You can tax alcohol, you can tax cigarettes, you can tax cars, you could tax video games, you could tax, I don't know, resurfacing hardwood floors in those companies if you really wanted to, but it's got to be something that is enforceable. And why do we have taxes? You name it. Defense. And as we'll see in a little bit, and as we've talked about this year, more than 50% of the U.S. budget goes for defense. So we need some money for that. Welfare, and I don't mean just like a welfare program, I mean the general welfare and how vague that is back from when, Jefferson and Madison are talking about it. So anything that looks out for the people. So, I mean, it could be, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, whatever, but it could also be like, public health spending, whatever. And then, of course, you still need to be able to pay government workers and hopefully pay off some of the U.S. debt. We're not going to jump into the debt clock now because I assume it is still singed into your retinas from when we looked at it a couple months ago. But there's the link on there if you guys want to click it. As always, the slides are attached to this assignment. So you can tax for anything and spend it on anything. A big thing they're going to have to spend it on are entitlements. So that is what the government is legally obligated to pay for. So that would be Social Security, government pensions, things that they could be sued if they don't follow through on that. You pay into Social Security, you expect to get stuff out of it. Now, as for your generation, and mine for that matter, we're kind of toast on that, but entitlement spending needs to be gone through. The government cannot say we're just not going to pay federal pensions this month, or we're just not going to send out Social Security checks or Medicare or Medicaid or anything like that. You can't do that. There's also discretionary funding, and that is the government chooses what exactly they want to do with that money. So a big thing that you could think of here is the president's border wall with Mexico. Part of that is paid for out of just blanket Department of Defense and Homeland Security money that wasn't allocated anywhere in particular. But there's also parts of that that have caused an issue because it's discretionary spending. So the House and the Senate have agreed that this much money has to be spent on, one specific thing that doesn't apply to the border wall. And so therefore that money needs to be raised from elsewhere because once it's allocated, it can't be reallocated without passing a new law. But discretionary spending is a big thing, as Congress gets to decide exactly where that money will be spent. Also, is our budget balanced? It most certainly is not. We spend more money than we make, which is why we continue to go into debt. Is if we had to have a balanced budget, the government stimulus package that came out for coronavirus would mean that we would have to not spend trillions of dollars elsewhere, which clearly we are still spending that money as well. So there's no legislation at a national level for a balanced budget. There have been constitutional amendments proposed about setting a balanced budget, and that really is a sword that cuts both ways. On one side, yes, it would be great to have a balanced national budget, like our state, for example, has a balanced state budget. But the problem is that the part that cuts the other way is that if you have to have that budget, you need to stop spending on stuff. Or if there's an emergency, what do you do? And the answer is sort of, if you have balanced budget legislation, you're sort of toast if you're the federal government. So like a couple years ago when we had all those really bad fires, we ran over our budget, but we went to the federal government, we went to FEMA and said, we need money, this is a natural disaster. And FEMA's like, you're right, it is a national disaster, and therefore we got federal funding to offset the fact that we were out of money within the state to pay for that. So that is sort of the plus and minus of requiring a balanced budget. Is it's good, it stops you from going into debt, but at the same time, what happens if you need to go to war, or there's a massive once in a century viral outbreak? Then you've got to be able to spend money on that sort of stuff and spend money you don't have. There is what the president asked for, OMB, Office of Management of the Budget, right there. This is what the president asked for with the 2020 budget. This is just discretionary stuff. So this is where he wants to spend money. This is not including stuff like entitlements. That's elsewhere. Because you can't really mess around with how much you need to spend on entitlements. So the president and his advisors saying, yes, we need to spend $718 billion on defense. We need to spend $13 billion on the interior, et cetera, et cetera. This is discretionary, which means it's at his call and then Congress's call where they want to spend it. So the president will propose that budget, but remember, it's Congress that has to actually sign off on the budget. And that's why we don't really have budgets anymore. We just sort of do continuing resolutions to keep spending money that we don't have. That's how it's worked for years, and that's how it will probably continue to work from here on out. Now, is there a limit to how much money we can borrow? Nope, there isn't. As you can see up here, war and tax cuts have paid for, have created a large amount of the national debt. This number has gone up as well because we also have the Trump tax cuts, which would mean that would go even higher up here. But there's no balanced budget, there's nothing that says the government can only spend so much money or borrow so much money and then they have to stop. Instead, we just have to worry about, are we able to pay back those loans that we make? And those loans are usually in the form of treasury bonds. Are we able to pay those treasury bonds back? And if we are, then we're okay. You can't print money, though. You do have to try to pay off that deficit or operate. It only goes so far, because if you can't pay off that deficit, it gets worse. And remember, that deficit is made out of loans that we have. So we need to be able to pay those loans back, or our credit goes in the tank. Nobody loans us any more money. And then you become Greece in 2013 or whatever, and your economy craters because you have no credit anymore. But as you can see here, it's unpleasant. Our deficit right now is probably moving towards looking like it did after the housing crisis, due to the amount of spending that the federal government has had to do as a stimulus package. So, sorry, I know that's scary. Patrick's afraid too. Now, how do you categorize that spending? This is pretty simple, but let's go through it. You could have social policy spending, and keep this stuff in mind as you're writing your bill this week. So this is paying for the general welfare, Social Security, SNAP, Medicare, Medicaid. How much should the government be spending on helping out Americans versus how much should Americans be self-reliant or looking for charity to help afford things that they need to sort of keep going? So that changes with administrations, that changes with, the national attitude of the country. Environmental policy. Nature and its effects on the world around us. So that could be, do we sign up for the Paris Peace Accords? Do we not sign up for them? Do we enforce the Clean Air Act or Clean Water Act? Do we not? How much regulation is good to keep the environment safe and, America's, natural resources and natural beauty where it's at? And how much do we, do away with that for economic benefit? That's really up to Congress and how much money they want to spend on enforcing environmental policy or not. Labor policy. What is the government going to set up for, negotiations with unions? How do we keep workers employed? Do we let each state figure out what it wants to do with unions? That's what we do right now. And how much flexibility do we allow there? So NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, that is your union negotiation group. So if, say, a company, let's choose like Tyson Chicken or something, because there's stuff with food plants going on right now. If there were a union in that plant, they might say, hey, we're not going back to work. We're going on strike until we get proper protective equipment to work in here. And their company says, nope, we're not going to do that unless you take, a 5% pay cut. And they argue back and forth, and neither side can come to a conclusion. Then the National Labor Relations Board gets involved, and they will mediate that dispute, and then both sides have to agree to that. OSHA, you're all aware of, that's safety. Don't cut your fingers off, don't burn yourself, don't fall into a vat of acid, all that sort of stuff. The government sets up those standards and then has to enforce those standards. Economic policy. This is everything we just talked about. So this is, how much do we tax? How much money do we spend ourselves into debt with versus should we, increase taxes and scale back on spending and try to cut into that debt? Or do we just keep going and hope for the best? How does the Fed set monetary value? Loans, bonds, all that sort of stuff. How do we make sure that we don't overinflate our currency or underinflate our currency? How do we avoid ending up like Germany after World War I? All of that is, economic and monetary policy. Those really do go hand in hand. Is economic is sort of the business end of it, and monetary is literally like, how much is our money worth? And then you got foreign policy. How are we going to spend money to uphold a treaty or an alliance or trade? How do we make sure that, we're paying our part in NATO, and we pay a lot of NATO, but also we're the biggest country in NATO, so it stands to reason. The special friendship, how do we deal with, the British? Do we kind of look the other way on some stuff that's maybe legally dubious, like the Falklands Island War in the 80s? Maybe we do. How do we do that? Basically, foreign policy is, how is the U.S. going to interact with the world at large? So yeah, that is all of that stuff. So those are sort of the big ways that the federal government thinks about spending. Um, Remember, this says categorize, not prioritize. So it's each session of Congress, each presidential term is going to prioritize this stuff differently. So it is a constantly moving platform. Back to the Commerce Clause. Back to Mike Vick. We all remember Mike Vick gets rung up on RICO charges because he's racketeering. He's committing a crime across state lines by laundering money. All that. Just a quick refresher here. If the goods or the person passes from state to state, then it's interstate commerce. If it stays within the state, then it's intrastate commerce, and the feds have no control over it. Because of the very easy way to show basically any business at this point can probably get regulated by the feds because you can sell stuff online so easily, gives the feds a ton of expansion or of power to expand. So any sales across state borders, you commit a crime like Mike Vick, you go over state borders, dealing with Native American tribes, you are crossing from a state onto a reservation. That means the feds have control over it, not the state. And any foreign trade. All of that is Commerce Clause. All of that is stuff Congress has to keep in mind. Moving on. Currency. Congress has the power to coin money. So you can use this to create the various banks of the United States and kind of the Federal Reserve System. But they can also create legal tender. So coin money is literally coins. Legal tender is the cash you have on hand. We don't actually do this until after the Civil War because originally we just let private banks issue their own legal tender, but it got too confusing and it became a giant hassle. So eventually Congress made a deal with the Treasury where they basically said, hey, Treasury Department, you guys print all the money for us and we'll call it a day. So currency regulation is technically under the auspices of Congress, but they have largely delegated that authority to the Treasury Department. All right. More on money. Congress has the power to establish national bankruptcy laws. That's why we covered it during the judicial branch with bankruptcy courts. The rationale behind that, of course, was that you don't want different bankruptcy laws in different states because then people could really abuse that, or they could just run from state to state going bankrupt until you run out of all 50 and then you start, working backwards. Instead, it's a federally regulated thing. And those laws have only been in effect since the late 70s when interstate commerce continued to take off and the country sort of shrank, if you will, due to increased interconnectedness. We also have power of the purse. These are the two most expensive pictures of purses I could find. Not like I had to pay for them. Pictures of expensive purses, let's say it that way. And the power of the purse basically means that Congress has the power of appropriations. I'm going to put this as a question on that quiz. I almost guarantee it. But Congress has discretionary power. They choose when they're setting out the budget how much money each department gets. So if they think that the Department of Defense needs more money, they can decide to give the Department of Defense more money. If they think the Department of Health and Human Services needs less money, then they give less money to the Department of Health and Human Services. And at the end of the day, it's Congress's call as to how they're going to allocate that money. And like I said when we were talking about the president's border wall earlier, they can dictate specific purposes. They can allocate that money to a specific thing. So, hey, Department of Defense, here's this money. You need to spend it specifically on, this $30 billion needs to go towards this fleet of new ships, or this $12 billion needs to go to the Veterans Administration specifically to hire more nurses in rural areas for VA hospitals. That money doesn't get spent anywhere else. That's the power of the purse. If they get in trouble with that, then, I mean the people receiving this money, if they misspend that money, then Congress can investigate them. The FBI can go in and charge those people with crimes. Congress is giving them the money for a specific reason with those congressional appropriations and the allocation therein. So Congress has the final say. So we're almost done here. Congress has the power to declare war. Technically, only Congress has that power, but as we talked about during the executive branch, that has sort of changed over the years. Congress also has the power to change a pirate to a privateer. And a privateer just means you have a contract from the government to attack enemy shipping. We don't really do that anymore. It's unfortunate because it used to be kind of fun. Remember, to declare war, you need a 2/3 vote from both houses, so 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House both need to say, yes, we're going to war, and then the president has to sign off on it. It's never happened where Congress has been like, we're going to war, and the president's like, nah, doesn't happen. As you see at the bottom there, the 1973 War Powers Act under Nixon gave the executive branch a whole bunch of leeway in declaring war. Before that, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson had all had to kind of go through Congress. Congress had signed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution that gave President Johnson a bunch of flexibility without really declaring war in Vietnam. But long story short, the president largely declares this sort of stuff now, but Congress still has to sign off every usually 6 months to a year on if they want to continue combat operations in a theater going. Because, remember, they've got that part of the purse, and if they decide to cut funding for, troops in Afghanistan or whatever, the president doesn't really have a way to work around that other than he's got, 6 months to pull those troops out. So, there's your war powers. Other stuff. Congress is the only one that gets to determine how people get to become U.S. citizens. So, Congress has said you've got to be, and this is to apply on your own. If you're a minor, it's a little bit different. We're not going to go into that. But if you're applying to be a U.S. citizen, you've got to be 18. You have to have lived in the country legally for the 5 previous years, holding a green card, which is approved by the federal government. You need to have lived at least 3 months in the state in which you were applying as like a legal resident of that state. You need to be able to read, write, and speak basic English, despite the fact that you can actually take the test in a number of different languages. This is basically making sure that you understand what you're saying when you're being asked questions. It doesn't mean you need to be fluent in English. It doesn't need, this is a very rudimentary understanding. An attachment to the U.S. Constitution, so basically, yes, I will uphold the Constitution, and that's what you'll see in the loyalty oath at the end there, but you need to understand the gist of it. So, there are 3 branches of government, you vote for your president, that sort of stuff. You need to demonstrate good character. This basically means don't be a felon. And if you're a felon, they can pull your green card at any time anyway and boot you. Then you need to take the citizenship test. You guys took that at the beginning of the year. There's some more questions for you right now. And then you take the citizenship oath. And assuming you have done all of that, congratulations, Congress says you are now a United States citizen. Congress also has powers over the post offices. So when the president's talked recently about how he wants to close down the post office, not the president's call. This is a power of Congress. Also, it employs, well over 100,000 people in the country. So shutting down the post office is not realistic. Also because the Constitution guarantees that we have a post office, so you can't really kill it off. Remember, the post office is in big trouble because in 2003, 2004, Congress passed a law that said the post office needs to be able to fund the next, I believe it's 50 years of retirement pension stuff, which is way longer than any other government or private company is legally required to have pension money on hand, which basically means that if the post office didn't have to do this, they'd be well in the black. They'd be making more money than they spent. But because of that requirement made in the early 2000s, they are operating at a deficit and continue to do so. Congress also deals with copyright. They've created a special office for this, but it is congressional law that sets the qualifications, timeline, sets up the office and agents to investigate stuff and make sure that nobody's stealing anything, assess and analyze claims that, somebody violated copyright or a patent or whatever. All that sort of stuff, copyright and patent, are powers of Congress. Now, it's not like congressmen are going to do this. It's not like Representative Gianforte spends 2 days a week at the Congressional Patent Office making sure they hire people to do this. These are federal employees of the federal bureaucracy that work with this, but rather than being part of the executive branch, they answer to Congress, like the post office answers to Congress. All right. The elastic clause. Get it? Elastic? See, you guys miss this stuff. I know you do. Congress has the ability to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the powers listed in Article 1. Total, almost total, flexibility. Create a national bank? Yep, we need it to make sure the economy goes? Fine. Regulate interstate commerce? Are we going to, figure out that the Commerce Clause basically means what we want? Yep. Have we decided that sexual offenders deserve increased punishment because they're a threat to the community? Yep. That is necessary and proper. It is proper for, the defense of, the country's children, whatever. Done. So necessary and proper clause, this is just one more reminder that the elastic clause is there to make sure that the government and specifically the legislative branch has the power to do what it needs to do to make sure the country runs smoothly. I know I'm beating a dead horse here. I think we've done this 3 times this year already, but Congress also plays a role in presidential elections. If a presidential election ends in a tie or nobody gets 270 electoral votes, then the House of Representatives decides. If the House can't reach the decision, then it devolves to the states. It's never devolved to the states. We had the corrupt bargain in 1824. We had the backroom deal that let Rutherford B. Hayes be president in 1876. All of this means that Congress makes the final call. If the electors can't do it, then Congress votes on it. Impeachment. You guys know this. The House brings the charges as long as a majority votes for it. Oh, we should have changed this. It's 3 now. The Senate acts as the jury. 2/3 of them need to vote to convict, and the Supreme Court, specifically the Chief Justice, in our case Roberts, acts as the judge. 3 presidents have been impeached: President Johnson, President Clinton, President Trump. This remains the same. No presidents have ever been convicted. Richard Nixon was never impeached. He quit before he was going to be impeached. And ladies and gentlemen, that is it for the year in your government class 4 lectures. So go ahead, take that quiz. Good luck on it. Make sure you use your notes or refer back here so you do well on it. And that's it. Have fun writing your bill this week, and I'll talk to you later. See you.